Hello everybody. Today I will be discussing psychological and mathematical similarities of poker and the stock market. So I assume if you clicked on this video you have an interest in both of these subjects, which I hope you do, because I expect the person who's viewing this video to regularly play poker and trade stocks. By regularly, it doesn't mean you have to play, every day. You could play once or twice a week, or maybe once or twice every few weeks, something of that nature, but I expect you to regularly do it. So, therefore, I expect basic knowledge in each. You don't have to be a professional or an expert by any means, but you gotta at least know the basics. So, by the end of this presentation, I hope you can better understand the intersection between these two subjects, because I'm going to be listing, a few things I'm going to be listing you may consider common sense, but some of them you may not consider common sense. But the main thing I want you guys to know is I want you guys to understand why these similarities and differences occur. I want you to understand how to profit from them. So what will we go over? So this is the outline of this presentation. I'm going to start out with mentioning what is gambling, because I think this is something that's important to cover. There's a lot of different definitions online, and to be honest, looking at the definition, anyone could classify something as gambling, and you'll see that in the next slide. We're also going to go over trading versus poker just in general. You guys probably know most of these similarities and differences, but it's something important to know. However, I'm going to focus on psychological similarities and differences and mathematical similarities and differences. Obviously, there's more than just these two categories, but this is what I've decided to focus on, as I believe they're the most important. And I'm also going to dedicate a whole section to algorithms, because this is something that's become very popular recently. By recently, well, for the stock market, I guess I should say past 20 years, but in poker, it's actually relatively recent, like the past 5 years, where it's started to become quite popular. And especially now, just in the past 6 months, ever since we had the ChatGPT bubble, there's been a lot of stuff where people are selling programs that mention AI in the title. I'm going to be discussing why this matters and the real life implications. So, regarding gambling, these are the definitions I found online. I got one from a research article I had. I also got one from dictionary.com, because that's the most common place you'd find a definition. So, the first definition is staking something on a contingency. And what that means, if you don't know, it just means betting on something that's unlikely. So I wrote betting on a statistical anomaly, and that means, let's say, there's a 1% chance. That's like the lottery, essentially. Lottery, you have a very low chance of winning, but hey, you could win. So I guess that's what they consider gambling. And I think that's a very, vague definition of gambling. Obviously, something like that could be a subset of gambling, but just because that's true, I don't think that necessarily means it's gambling. Then another definition is the activity or practice of playing at a game of chance for money or other stakes. Yeah, I guess this is true, but just like the other definition, I believe that this is true for some cases of gambling, but just because this is true doesn't mean that it's necessarily gambling. And the last one is the act or practice of risking the loss of something important by taking a chance or acting recklessly. And that I have similar beliefs about that one too, except that one is, recklessly. I don't think you can necessarily not gamble and, not be reckless. Well, okay, so now I'm going to discuss my definition of gambling, and my definition is pretty simple. It's a lot shorter than the other ones. It's simply just doing something with negative EV, or expected value. Personally, I think this is a very good definition of gambling, and I'll explain why after I give the example. So, the example is you have an option of playing a game where you flip an unfair coin. You have a 60% chance of landing on heads and a 40% chance of landing on tails. If you land on heads, you lose $100, and if you land on tails, you make $100. So, this is a pretty simple example. You either make or lose money, however, the probabilities are skewed. But obviously, you have to give $100. You can't just play for free. So this is the computation for expected value. It's essentially a weighted average. It's a relatively straightforward formula. You just multiply what you're going to win by the percent chance, and you sum all of those. So what this value here, negative 20, this means on average we expect to lose $20. So by computing EV, you can determine whether or not this is a good bet to make. And obviously, if it's negative, you don't want to place the bet, because you're going to end up losing money. So I would consider this gambling, because sure, you can make money, but on average, you're going to lose money. And that differs from these prior definitions, because these are all quite vague. And you may think mine can sound vague as well, but basically what mine implies is that you're doing the activity and it's in your favor. The main goal here is that the odds are in your favor, and these don't really mention if the odds are in your favor or not. So now let's go over trading versus poker, and I'm going to discuss the main key differences that differentiate these two activities. So I'm going to go over trading differences first, and the first one is the market goes up, and by market I mean the overall market. It doesn't have to be a specific stock, and as you can see, the image in the top right, that's a picture of the S&P 500 over the past 10 years. And if you zoom out, you can look at the past, 40, 50 years, the market just goes up. And the reason for this is because we're always printing money. So more money you put into the economy, the more the market's going to go up. It just stimulates it. And that's something that's very important, actually, because in poker, like when you're playing, it's a zero-sum game. No one like throws in money into the game and inflates the player's money or anything like that. Like the money you put in the game, let's assume there's no rake, the money you put in the game, there's not going to be any new money added. But in the market, that's not necessarily true, and that makes it actually a lot easier. And another difference is this is quite difficult because there's no single best strategy. And I say this differs from poker because poker, you know what to do. Like you're dealt aces pre-flop, you raise, your opponent re-raises. I mean, you're not you know what to do from then on. And you're never going to fold aces pre-flop, like never. There's just no reason because we know it's negative EV. But like the market, like there are some situations where you may never want to do something, but it's very difficult to prove. Poker, it's easy to prove because we have 52 cards in a deck, we have rules, and we have probabilities to go by. And another important difference is that in poker, you're always going to lose the whole bet. In the stock market, like you don't have to lose the whole bet. Like if I buy a share of Apple, I could lose 10% or and sell it. Like Apple's probably not going to go to zero, but poker, if I lose, I'm losing my bet. And that's something that's also important too, because there's no partial losses in poker. You win or you lose. And the main reason the last thing I want to consider is asynchronous versus synchronous. And by this I mean, when you're trading, I guess there's a lot of different ways to trade, but you don't necessarily have to sit in front of the computer all day. Like you can buy a stock and not touch it for 3 months. Or I mean, obviously you could day trade too, but you don't have to sit at it all the time. With poker, you got to sit at the table. Like you can't really leave. It's very time consuming and it can be monotonous at times. Sure, trading can too, but you don't have to just be confined to an area. And this is why I actually don't play poker that much as I used to, because I don't have much time anymore, and it's just really time consuming. But trading, I don't have to just sit like a table to trade all day. So now I can finally get into the psychology. So obviously this is a question everyone asks: why do most people lose money in poker stocks? As you know, around 90% of people lose money in the stock market. I don't know the exact figure for poker, but it's probably quite similar. First thing I want to discuss is fear and greed. These are two polarizing emotions, and these two emotions are really important because if humans did not have fear or greed, it would be likely that these two activities would be a lot easier. Because, I mean, you look at a stock market, like a chart here, like for SPY, as you see, I mean, it's all ups and downs. Like this can also be a representation of human emotions. And when the market's down a lot, generally there's a lot of fear. When it's up a lot, there's a lot of greed. And why is that bad? Well, thing is, these two emotions can cloud your logic. And this is similar in poker as well. I mean, here's a good example. Like, let's say you're playing and you're not getting good hands, and then you fold. Let's say you get dealt like 5-8 off, and you fold, and then flop comes 8-8-5, and it's the worst feeling ever. Like you should have folded, and that's also comes into like fear of missing out. But then you start to become greedy. It's like, okay, maybe I'll play it, and you're like, let's see if I can try and make this, and it all links together: fear, greed, FOMO, and then regret as well, because you regret not playing. And that's just an example of greed. Another example of greed is markets going up a lot, and you're like, well, let's see how far it can go, and then you don't sell in time, and then you end up probably taking a loss or not making as much as you should have. Similarly, we can say the same about fear. If you're playing against, let's say in poker, you're playing against somebody who you know is very good, you may be more inclined to fold in a situation where you probably shouldn't. You may not play as aggressively, because in poker and the stock market, playing aggressive is important. You have to know when to play aggressive or not. Obviously, I assume you guys know that. And also doubling down. Obviously, in the market, you're down a lot. You don't want to be doubling down. Same with poker. You don't want to just refire chips if you're already in a bad state of mind. And that also leads into our behavior after big wins and losses. One article I was looking at, they did a study where they analyzed professional poker players. Or no, that's the next one. They analyzed normal players and their behavior and emotions after big wins and losses. They found after big wins, generally players are less aggressive because they want to preserve their gains, and after losses, they're more aggressive because they want to win back their losses. And this is not necessarily the logical approach. I mean, it depends because, in poker, if you're short stack, you might have to play more aggressively, but this is based off emotions. It's not based off of logic. And I just kind of discussed that lack of rational thinking under pressure. I mean, fear and greed are pretty much synonymous to pressure as well, just slightly different. And that comes into the next study I found, which did an analysis of professional players and normal players and analyzed their thinking. And they found professional players exhibited exceptional statistical and rational thinking, especially under pressure. However, another issue is like gambling addictions. Now, I don't think this is as big of an issue in the market. Like, it's still an issue, but with poker, it's probably a little worse. But pros versus normal players, pros have very good self-control. Normal players, they can be very compulsive, and that's also an issue. So now I'm going to discuss probably one of the most important and less understood aspects of poker, which is bluffing. I feel like when everyone thinks of poker, they think about bluffing. A lot of the movies, they portray a massive bluff. And obviously, this is a vital part of poker, and we know this because we have trained. I'll get into this later when I discuss the algorithms part, but we have trained, or I guess I should say, these bots have trained themselves to be exceptional poker players. They play against themselves and they play against other players, and all of them, they end up bluffing, which is interesting because you may think bluffing is not a requirement, but it pretty much is to play at Nash equilibrium. And now this is obviously ties into fear and greed because, like I mentioned earlier with the example where you're playing a good player, if a good player bets big, you may think, oh, he's a good player, he definitely has it. Like, you don't know if he's bluffing or not. And if you guys have ever played against a poker bot, I don't know what it is with them, but they actually bluff quite often. But the thing is, you never know when they're bluffing. Like, you can't tell, and that's how you know if someone's really good or something is really good, because you can't even tell. And this actually is interesting because I'm sure some of you guys may know it. It depends, but there's also bluffing in the stock market, and this is also known as order spoofing. And this is pretty straightforward. When you're making an order, you can spoof how many shares you want to buy. So let's say you want to buy 100 shares of SPY instead of 100, you could put 5,000. And the thing with this is it could scare away other people who are trying to buy or sell. And this obviously, I assume if you're watching this video, if you're not an institutional trader, like this is not really relevant, or if you're not trading at the high level or lots of volume. Now, most people don't have to worry about this. Like, it doesn't matter as much. Like with poker, like you're gonna bluff at every level, like even if you're a beginner. But in the stock market, this is quite advanced. And here's some things to consider. Now, I kind of covered this earlier, but why do all professional players bluff? Well, I mentioned because you essentially have to bluff to keep the advantage. It also comes in with switching up your gameplay. You can't be too predictable. That's also an issue because, at the high level, players are quite good at reading, and if you always play a certain way, if you never bluff, it's easy to play against you because every time you bet big and you've never bluffed, it's like, okay, you have it, you just fold pretty much, but if you bet big, it's like, oh, does he have it? Does he not? I don't know what to do. It adds a lot more degrees of difficulty to the game. And is understanding emotions vital to a successful poker player? The answer is no, because we have computers, and computers are very successful at playing poker, and they don't understand emotions. And this is something you guys may think is like not as straightforward, because you always think like, oh, poker's a lot about reading the other player. And I mean, we may think that, but clearly that's not as important as we think. If players can, bots can play against any type of players and not be able to read them at all. And this is like they play, and even online poker, it's a lot harder to read. So, last thing I'm going to discuss how common is order spoofing. I kind of already covered this, but yeah, at the beginner level, not particularly common. Most brokers don't even, I mean, it depends what broker you're using, but probably won't allow you to order spoof and probably won't even need it. So that's just for if you're trading high volume. So now I'm going to discuss the mathematics. I'm just going to cover a few simple mathematics, and I'm not going to go too in depth. This is just, like I mentioned earlier, it's pretty much an introduction if you're interested in play poker and stocks. So we'll go through probability and statistics, bet sizing, and risk management. You could consider that under probability and statistics, but I think it deserves its own section. And then also algorithms, which I've already covered a little bit. So probability and statistics. In poker, computing probabilities are easy. You're given cards, you can easily compute probabilities. You're dealt ace ace, for example. I mean, you know that you have a 0.0045% chance. And it's really easy to compute because 52 cards in the deck, you have 4 aces. You get 1 ace, you have to decrease the total count in the deck and the amount of aces by 1, and you multiply that. So how do we do this in the stock market? Well, you can't do it simply because there's no rules to follow by. You don't have a certain amount of cards. So obviously it's still possible to have a statistical edge, but you got to be a little more creative with it. And that's why when coming up with a good strategy, there's a lot of back testing involved. And obviously past performance does not guarantee future performance, but you can assert with high confidence that certain things will happen. Again, nothing is guaranteed. That's why it's so difficult to trade, at least. So I'm going to give an example now. So let's say when the market is green on Friday, there's a 60% chance the market is green on Monday. How do we know there's a 60% chance? Well, we take a sample. Maybe we've seen it in the past 1,000 times. Maybe we've tested it in live trading for 6 months. It's around 60%. So we can assert with high confidence 60% chance. So that's when we can essentially, this is most similar to getting dealt ace ace. You have a strategy and you compute the probability, and we don't know exactly how green the market will be on Monday or how red the market will be on Monday. So that's something that's important, which is risk reward, which I'm going to cover in the next few slides. So now we can talk about bet sizing. So if you recall the previous example I gave a few slides ago, I'm going to modify that example. So you have an option of playing a game where you flip an unfair coin. The coin has a 60% chance of landing on heads, 40% chance of landing on tails. If you land on heads, you lose the bet amount. And if you land on tails, you make double the bet amount. So this is different because we're not betting $100. You can bet as much as you want. You could bet your whole net worth. And also I flipped it. So you actually have a 60% chance of, or no, you have a 40% chance of doubling your money and a 60% chance of just losing it. So obviously this is positive expected value. We have the computation here. So on average, you're expected to win 20% of your bet. So you have $100, you're expected to win $20. And how much should we bet? Should we bet all of our life savings? I mean, it's positive EV. We can just keep, we're guaranteed to make money, right? Well, this is more complex than you think because, I mean, it may seem obvious, but some people may jump to conclusions and say, oh, we can just bet as much money as we have. We have a bankroll of $1,000. We should bet $1,000. And that's not necessarily the case because we still have a 60% chance of losing all of our money. And that is a pretty big chance. And even if the chance is 1%, we want to minimize that chance. We want to minimize the risk of ruin. So what's the solution to this? One potential solution is the Kelly criterion. And basically this is a formula that computes optimal betting size. I'm not going to go too much in detail into this. If you guys are interested in anything I'm discussing, I'll write all of the references in the description. You can read all the papers. They're quite interesting. So I showed this graph here because this is a great representation on how much we should bet. So obviously if we bet too little, which is indicated by the left side. The x-axis is 0, y-axis is 0. We're just going to make minimal money. If we have $1,000, we bet $1 every time. Yeah, we'll eventually, we'll make money. It's just going to take a while. And obviously, if we bet our $1,000, well, eventually, we're going to end up just losing all of our money just because we get unlucky one time. Or I guess in this case, it's not necessarily unlucky. It's just we shouldn't bet that amount. So obviously, there's an optimal bet that maximizes how much you win and minimizes how much you lose. However, with this, I'm not saying it's impossible to lose. It's like, oh, if I have $1,000 and let's say the optimal betting amount's 50, I'll bet 50 and I'll never lose money. That's not necessarily true, but it's a very low probability. So now I'm going to actually get into the formula, how to compute this. This is an actual formula here, but it's simplified. You probably won't have, there's not much application of this in the stock market just because I listed where losing the bet involves the entire wager. That's not too common in the market. Maybe for trading options, you may lose the entire wager a lot. But obviously in poker, this can be applicable here. And the problem with Kelly criterion is that if you're playing a game, it's going to be hard to compute this, but it's still fun to research. So as you can see here, let's have F star is the fraction of the current bankrolled wager. This is what we're trying to find. So back on this slide, F star would be the wagered fraction, as you can see, where x-axis 20%, y-axis 2%. Excuse me, sorry. And P is the probability of a win, and Q is the probability of a loss. So let's go back to that previous example, and our win percent is 40%, our loss percentage is 60%, and B is essentially our risk to reward. And here we're doubling our money, so that's why it's 2. So we can implement this into the formula, and we get 0.1. So this means we should bet 10% of our bankroll, and computing the risk of ruin here. So 10% means if we lose, which is a 60% chance 10 times in a row, that's pretty darn low, right? So basically there's a 0.6% chance of happening of losing all of our money. So that's what we want. We want a low percent chance. So this essentially maximizes how much we'll make and minimizes our risk. Now I'm going to get into probably the most, I'd say at least in our current era, this is the most important thing to understand here. So this is automation of poker in the stock market. So as of now, the best poker players are computers. I mean, I don't know how they'll change in the future. I just assume the computers will get better and better. And this was the first occurrence of this was when Facebook collaborated with Carnegie Mellon University and created the poker bot Pluribus. And this was the first bot that was able to consistently beat professional poker players at the highest level. And this was astronomical because in the past, the bots could only beat poker players on one-on-one, or like like a 2-person table, 3-person table, but this is 6-person table. So this is very important. And it's self-training AI. You feed it data and it trains on that data and it improves from it. You don't actually have to have it play against other players. You can just refeed the data to it and it learns from it. And what I found pretty interesting is you can actually train it very efficiently. You only need about $150 of computing power, which means you can go to Google and pay them $150 for a server and you can train this yourself. So now this is pretty cool because if you think about it, to become a professional poker player, you have to pretty much dedicate your life. And even if you do that, not everyone gets to that level. And, just a computer and $150, you can train it to be at a professional level. And the most important thing you can probably learn from this is, well, the main difference is it eliminates emotions. And this is not, I don't believe Pluribus is open source. Maybe like a simplified version is, perhaps you could train it yourself, but you could implement this online poker, but it's probably not allowed. You probably get banned. Obviously, unless it's like there's poker bot tournaments, as I'll discuss in like 2 minutes. But online poker, you could use a bot and play, but you'd probably get banned if they found out. Obviously, if it's a self-training bot, you're not probably going to get banned. But This is the problem when using bots in poker. If let's say your goal is straight like simply to make money in poker, you can't really use bots because that's not allowed. So, but you can compete in poker bot tournaments. You can program a bot and have it compete in a tournament, which is honestly pretty fun. So if you guys are interested in that, this hosted by MIT, I believe, and it's sponsored by a lot of quantitative trading firms, which is interesting. That shows the intersection between these two subjects. So now let's go over automating stocks. So overall, according to the SEC, it increased market quality and liquidity, but it can have an increased volatility in certain periods. If you look back, 2020, we had a lot of volatility. A lot of that was just, algorithms haven't experienced COVID before, and whenever you have a new experience, the algorithms can go kind of crazy. And the reason why it impacted the market so much is most of the trading volume is from algorithmic trading. And this is because I'm not saying more people algorithmic trade, but the volume is because the top institutions, they use a lot of algorithms, and obviously they're going to have billions of dollars, while there might be more people who trade discretionarily, but there's not more dollar volume. And likewise with a poker bot, this eliminates emotions, and the best part about this is they're not really regulations or rules against it. That's why the stock market is great. I mean, it's basically whoever has the best mind can win. You don't have to be confined to certain rules. Like, sure, poker, like it's similar, but you still have to be confined to rules. In the market, you can come up with so many different types of strategies. And the final thing is, it's not clear if the best stock trader is a computer. Now, one might argue it is because all the top institutions do, but it depends how you define the best stock trader. If you define by making the most money, or if you define by the highest, or like I guess the best percent gain. But it's not as clear as in poker, because in poker you have tournaments at the highest levels. Like stock market, you don't really have tournaments. There are some competitions, but we have yet to see many of those where implement bots, or like bot only competitions. It's kind of hard to check whether people are using bots or not, stuff of that nature. So now we can finally get to why these similarities exist. And it really delves down to three simple things. And they're games of incomplete information. And if you don't know what that term is, basically it essentially means there's luck involved. So if you think about chess, there's no luck involved. You can see everything. But when you're playing poker, you don't know what your opponent may have. And even if you have the best hand, you can still lose. And with that, that's where it comes into that they're games of probability and they're games of emotion. So if we want to capitalize from this, we can consider two things here. We can think about a way to maximize our probabilities and minimize our emotions. So how can we benefit from them is, honestly, the simplest way to do so is come up with a plan. Or as I like to put it, you need to follow an algorithm. And you need to have a plan or an algorithm you can stick to. Now, this is why I think quantitative trading or algorithmic trading will be so popular in the future, because once you have an algorithm, it's a lot easier. You don't have to stress about it, because humans have a lot of weaknesses. Computers fix a lot of those weaknesses when it comes to these games. And another important thing is regarding probability, and it's that you need to have risk and reward clearly stated. The first thing in your head should always be, is this positive EV? And if you don't know if it's positive EV, then what are you doing? You should always know at least a little bit. Like, obviously, I don't expect you to compute EV in a poker game like by the exact decimal, but you should have at least some understanding. And eliminating emotions, that just comes from, you can either train yourself to be less harmed from negative emotions, or you can code algorithms. And I guess good ways to think of this is that gains and losses don't really mean anything. Like, if you win or lose, you kind of have to dissociate that from your playing, and it can be quite difficult. And you can also think about money doesn't actually exist, which is something that's obviously not true depending on who you ask. But if you think of money as not real and you think of it as just a video game that can alleviate the pressure, but even in video games, there's still lots of pressure even if money isn't involved. So overall, I think the best thing to do is, it depends what your goal is. In poker, if your goal is to maximize money and you can't use bots, obviously it's best just to maximize your understanding of probability and train yourself to be stoic in a sense. And you can say the same about the market, but personally, I think in the market, the best thing to do is just to code algorithms, because you can still make very successful algorithms. And you can make algorithms that, well, it depends on how much money you have, but well, assuming you're not like an institutional level type of volume, you won't need to code super advanced algorithms. You can have algorithms that beat the S&P relatively simply. So, yeah, that's all I have for today. I hope you guys found this helpful. Hope you guys didn't find it too boring. And like I mentioned earlier, I'm going to put all these references in the description.